I'm Barbara Gary.
Hi, my name's RG.
Hi, I'm Sarah Cottom.
My hesitation about Jesus and Christianity stemmed from being sexually abused when I was growing up. I basically just thought that God couldn't be this loving and caring God if he had allowed me to be placed in a house of abuse and addiction for most of my childhood.
I grew up believing that there was a God. I also grew up in a home with parents that told me over and over again that being a nice person and treating others nicely is all you needed to do in life. I had a wife and children that became saved, which I didn't know at the time what that was, and started going to church without me. Kind of felt that I didn't need church and spent my Sundays doing yard work, watching sports. Every Sunday, my wife and my daughter would come home, and she would never pressure me to go to church, but she would always tell me how awesome the message was and how awesome the people were. And my daughter was always proud to show me what she made in Sunday school. And I always felt guilty about that because I felt like I was missing something. I just didn't know what it was. But in my heart, I just didn't feel that religion was for me. And that's what I felt that they were seeking, was religion.
My biggest challenge was not knowing that there was a power greater than myself that could take me out of my 5-year meth addiction. I had no hope. My entire family was strung out on drugs and alcohol, and that's what I thought my life was going to be like for the rest of my life. I rode my bicycle around and stole scrap metal for a living, and in that I accumulated multiple felonies and misdemeanors, and I just thought that that's where my life was going. I have always been a driven person, but because of using meth and drugs and alcohol, it took me out of that, and I didn't know who I was, and I didn't know where I was going, or I didn't have any hope. And that's an ugly place to be.
Yeah, you know, pranks, hoaxes, somebody getting punked, April Fools, right? Pretty funny, unless you're on the receiving end of it. And especially if you end up embarrassed or made to look like a fool, or you're harmed in some way, physically or otherwise, or your video ends up on the big screen on Easter Sunday, right? Pretty funny if it's happening to the other guy, but nobody wants to be punked. Nobody wants to be actually on the receiving end of something that's that embarrassing. That's how it is, right? We like to laugh at other people's misfortune. The idea that there would be an April Fool's, the idea that there would be something of a hoax is the thing that we're exploring together today in our gathering, because we understand how it is. You know, I once thought that way about people that believed in Jesus. That was actually my view of them. It's like, seriously, you think that he died and that meant something for all of us and he rose from the dead? You got to be kidding me. In fact, I wasn't even sure he actually ever even existed. I mean, to me, it was just this sort of out there notion, and I couldn't imagine that people would actually believe in him. You know, there are those people that send you emails from time to time, often from like Nigeria or some other African nation, and they tell you about your good fortune that you've just won millions of dollars, and all you have to do is send them $500 to process your newfound fortune, and you too will be rich, right? And I think about that, and I think, now who would be foolish enough to fall for that kind of nonsense? Well, that was kind of the attitude I had about the idea of this Jesus, the cross, the empty tomb. The Bible is just too much for me to accept. And maybe that's how you feel today. It's like, yeah, I just don't know if I'm really there on all of that. It's like, that's okay for them. That's good for other people. If it gives them some comfort, great, that's fine. But I'm not so sure that I can actually embrace all of that. And if that's where you're at today, I have good news, because we're going to talk about things that will help you with the questions that you have. That was my view of the facts of Jesus' birth, his death on the cross, and the Bible tells us about his resurrection at a time in my life. But I later came to a realization that those things actually might be worth considering. And the idea that they might be deceptive in nature isn't anything new to our generation or to my life. As a matter of fact, right after Jesus died on the cross, there were those then that were concerned that deception actually would be instigated immediately. And so they ended up going to the authorities, and they wanted to do something to prevent the disciples from perpetuating the deception. We'll get to that text in God's Word in the Bible in a moment. But let me just say something about the Bible that I recognize to be true perhaps for some of you here today. For me, it's the source of most everything that I know and believe and understand to be true about Jesus and my relationship with him. But maybe you're thinking, yeah, I'm not so sure if the Bible really is trustworthy. And I think that's a fair question to ask. In fact, it's a question I've asked many times over the years and grappled with. Can I really trust this document? Can I really trust the pages of Scripture? Can I trust the Bible? And the first and most important aspect of that to ask and answer is whether or not it's trustworthy as an historical document. And I just want to especially help those of you who doubt it in that regard, or who know people who doubt it in that regard, by just talking a little bit about the historical reliability of the Bible. For all of us here to understand about the historical reliability of the Bible is to understand that we're not the first to ask the question. We're not the first to grapple with it. In fact, for hundreds of years, a whole lot of attention has been given to the historical reliability of the Bible. A lot of study has been devoted to it. And the result of all that effort and all those studies that are ongoing even today, the result is that they have proven to be more and more reliable over the years than they were ever thought to be. Let me give you some examples. For instance, we all know Aristotle, right? We've heard the name at least. He's a Greek philosopher, lived about 350 BC, give or take. Caesar, one of the first emperors of Rome, about 70 BC. None of us questions that they actually existed or that they lived, and we trust the things that we know to be true about them or have been taught in school or that other people tell us are true. And then the New Testament, of course, tells us about Jesus, in particular the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that are historical narratives. But here's something I think that will shed some light on that for you. With regard to Aristotle, we only have 49 manuscripts that tell us what we hold to be true about him. With regard to Caesar, 10 manuscripts, but with the New Testament, there are over 5,600 manuscripts that are available. And we're finding that the more manuscripts that are discovered over the years, as has been the case, the more reliable we find the scripture or the manuscripts to be. In fact, the more discoveries, the more textual accuracy they get, and the more trustworthy, just as an historical document. Even if you don't buy the idea of his resurrection, it's an historical document that has tremendous validity. In regard to that, there are over 200 prophecies concerning the birth of Christ, and those were fulfilled in the historical events surrounding his birth, right down to the detail. And most of those were well over 400 years prior to that when they were made and written down and then carried forward through the generations. There's another prediction, however, that to me is the most compelling, and that's the one that Jesus himself made. We know this from the historical account that we have in Matthew 24, verse 2. Jesus said, "Do you see all these things?" And he was asking his disciples a question. And he says, "Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down." Now what is he talking about? Well, the disciples and Jesus had been walking by, and they saw the temple, one that Herod had built for them, took years and years to complete. And Herod, the ruler from Rome, the king that Rome had placed over the Jews at the time, wanted to please the Jews and build them this magnificent temple. And so they were very proud of it, the Jews were, and they commented to Jesus about how magnificent it was. And Jesus responds with this statement, and he says, "Not one stone here will be left on another." Now, these stones are huge. I mean, they weigh tons, and it takes an army of people and some clever building and construction techniques to get these heavy stones placed up one on top of the other. And Jesus is making this amazing statement. He says, every one of these stones will be torn down off the other. And what he's saying is actually fulfilled, history tells us, non-biblical sources tell us that in 70 AD, the Roman army came to put down a rebellion against the Roman government, and the army came in and besieged Jerusalem. The city ended up catching fire and burning, and as it burned, the gold in the temple melted down into the cracks in between the stones, and the Romans, wanting that spoil for themselves, tore every stone off of every other stone so they could scrape the gold and take it for themselves. And history tells us, I mean, even if you don't buy everything else, the scriptures record accurately for us the history of Jesus' prediction, and other sources tell us that in fact that's exactly what happened, although Jesus predicted it some 40 years before it actually happened. Now, I said we were going to look at a passage where some people took issue with the fact that they thought Jesus was a deceiver and the disciples would perpetuate that deception. It's in Matthew 27. Let's take a look at it. Verse 62, it says, the next day, the one after preparation day, so Jesus is already in the tomb. The chief priests and the Pharisees went to Pilate. They had a request. So when they went to Pilate, here's what they said. Sir, they said, we remember that while he was still alive, that deceiver, that's their view of Jesus, that deceiver said, after 3 days, I will rise again. So here's what we're asking. Give the order for the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Doesn't matter after that, not needing to be permanent, but make it secure until the third day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal the body and then tell the people that he has been raised from the dead. This last deception will be worse than the first. And so, verse 65 tells us this. That Pilate answered and said, all right, take a guard, make the tomb as secure as you know him. So he provided a guard. They went and made the tomb as secure. And verse 66 says that they went, made the tomb secure, putting a seal on the stone and then posting the guard. Now, Roman guards knew that they would pay with their life if they didn't do their job. And their job was to guard the tomb to ensure that nobody got in there and stole the body of Jesus. But we know from the historical accounts in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that in fact Jesus rose from the dead. The stone is rolled away. The guards are nowhere to be found. And what Jesus predicted, in fact, took place. Now you say, well, how do we know that somehow the guards didn't get distracted and the disciples actually did steal the body? We know because their willingness to die. History tells us that all of Jesus' disciples suffered a martyr's death. Why would they be willing to risk their own lives and literally pay with their own lives if they knew that the whole idea of a resurrection was actually a hoax? That Jesus didn't rise from the dead, that they were trying to just peddle that idea and see how far it went, but when the chips were down, they would back away from that if they knew it to be a lie. But none of them backed away. And they didn't back away because they knew it to be a fact. The tomb was empty. They had seen Jesus multiple times after he was raised from the dead, and they lived their lives based on that truth. Their lives were changed, and the evidence that a changed or transformed life brings is a powerful thing. And there are people in this room whose lives are examples. They're evidence of the transforming power of Jesus Christ. And I'm one of them. And if you're a skeptic here today, if you're wondering, is this stuff really all real? Yes, historically, we know the account to be true. And the evidence of people whose lives have been changed here in this room and down through the last 2,000 years of church history is very real and very compelling. Earlier in our gathering, we were introduced to 3 individuals who described for us what life used to be like. They were talking about being in a place where they didn't know if there was a power strong enough to lift them up out of it. They wondered if there was a God who cared enough about what they'd gone through and what they were dealing with. Perhaps you identified with them as you were watching. Perhaps you're asking the same kinds of questions. Well, let's take a look and see their stories as they describe the turning point that they came to. Watch.
I feel like God just really worked on my heart by strategically placing people in my life who just really shared love with me unconditionally and just loved me when I was unlovable. And that started with my grandma, who took me to church when I was a teenager and continued on. I moved into a maternity home when I was pregnant with my son, and it was a Christian-based program, and the house parents there just really showed me love and just loved on me when I was really just awful. I was just not a nice person. So with all of that love I was shown, that really just started to open my eyes to this side of God that I didn't really understand when I was younger, this loving side. I went to visit my mom in Arizona, and on my way back, my flight was delayed by 5.5 hours. I was with 2 kids by myself. After that, when I got home, I just really threw my hands up and said, I can't do this by myself. I can't raise these 2 kids by myself. And I went to church that weekend, and that's when I accepted Christ.
The turning point for me in my life, religion versus relationship with Christ, came on a Sunday when my wife and daughter came home from church, and I was out working in the garden, and she just left a church bulletin on the hood of my truck, and I had to go in the garage for tools, and I picked it up and read it, and it said how to be a Christian, how to have a relationship with Christ. And I read it, and I thought, well, I do all of that. And then I went back out and worked in the yard, and it was just God tugging at my heart that he wasn't finished and we weren't done speaking. It was just crystal clear to me that it was my time to open my heart to him. So I went back in the garage, and also on the back of the bulletin was the sinner's prayer. And it was quiet, and it was time. And I opened my heart, and I said that prayer, and I meant it. And it was like immediately my brain went from religion to relationship, and I knew immediately that he was there. He was with me, and that my life was getting ready to be changed.
So my addiction led me to jail countless times, and the last time I was arrested and sentenced to 5 months in Spokane County Jail. And in there, I used while I was in there, and when I didn't know where I was going with my life still, and when I got out, I knew I didn't want to get loaded anymore, and I knew I didn't want to go back to jail. That's what I did know. So I ended up going to a recovery church, and I just sat in the front row because I am a tweaker and I don't like to get distracted, and so I just kept focusing and trying to figure out where my life is going, what I'm doing, and on a Friday night, I gave my life to Christ, not even knowing that it was real. The pastor gives you the opportunity, and he just says a prayer, and I was like, okay, maybe this is real, but why not? Why not try? And so I did. I just said it out loud, not even knowing if it was real. And then the blessings have just been crazy.
Amazing encounters. Each of them very personal. They experienced the undeniable power of Jesus at work in their hearts. The unconditional love of Jesus persuading their hearts. The desire of Jesus to have a personal relationship with them and share life with them. The willingness of Jesus to forgive all their sin. They had amazing encounters with him. And their decision to say yes to him started them on the journey, started them down the path of being a Jesus follower. But here's a question I want to pose to you today. What does it mean to be a Jesus follower? It's what we're all about here at Maryview Chapel. It's the question that we often ask ourselves and strive to define carefully and in a helpful way. It's something we're so passionate about. We put it on our website and our printed materials. It's on the wall as a reminder to all of us, because for us, it's the thing that's closest to our hearts. We want to be Jesus followers, and though we're not perfect and don't always follow with excellence, we're striving to be the best possible Jesus follower we can be. And at the same time, we want to help all the people that we can, people like yourselves, to be his followers as well. Well, there are lots of ways to answer this question, but at least 3 things are true, and I wanted to hit on them briefly. One is that it's what we're talking about. We're talking about a Jesus follower, someone who follows Jesus, not people. Now, Jesus is a person, but he's a very special person. He's God who came in human form, and he deserves to be followed. We're not talking about following an individual who has a particularly charismatic personality. We're not talking about an organization that you subscribe to. We're talking about following a person who not only died, but rose again and is very much alive today and very interested in having a relationship with you. We also mean that it's about following the ways of Jesus. In other words, to follow him means to live life the way he showed us it should be lived. Now, sometimes that means loving people that are hard to love, right? Sometimes that means forgiving people we don't necessarily want to forgive. And sometimes that means that we have to, in order to follow him, allow ourselves to be stretched and kind of moved out of our comfort zone to live life in a way that wouldn't necessarily be our first choice. And then finally, to follow Jesus means to follow Jesus for life. When my wife and I were about to be married, we had shared with each other our personal commitments to follow Christ. We knew that about each other, and we knew that neither one of us wanted to be married to someone who wasn't that committed to follow Jesus for their entire life. And so that was so close to our hearts and so much a part of our lives, even at that point, that in our wedding ceremony, that was one of the themes, that we have decided as not only individuals, but as a married couple, to follow Jesus, that there would be no turning back, that from here on out, we, the two of us, together would follow Jesus for the rest of our lives. And that's exactly what we did. But this following Jesus isn't something that's automatic. It actually starts with an event. It starts with a decision that you and I need to make. And that's touched on in places like John chapter 1, verse 12. It says, to all who believed in him and accepted him, the him is Jesus in this context, he gave the right to become children of God. Now, I think we'd all agree that the human race consists of all kinds of people, different nationalities and ethnicities, people of all different types all over the world. And because we're all human beings, we're all God's kids by creation. I mean, this whole idea, this human experience was his idea in the beginning, right? And so we're all his kids in that respect. But we're not all his kids against the backdrop of eternity in the light of his forever family. And this verse is very clear about that. It says, the ones that become children of God are the ones who believe in him and do what else? And accept him. I want to tell you a little bit of a story about my process, my journey before I came to Christ. I was at a place where I had moved from thinking it was nonsense and that people that believed that were being, gullible, to a place where I believed Jesus was right. He was true. He was someone who actually existed, and I wasn't really there all the way yet, but in my head I thought I was. Intellectually I believed. Intellectually I was in agreement with whatever the Bible said, but I didn't really know what it said. And so I thought I was there. I thought I was a Christian or a believer in Jesus. And I persisted with that kind of thinking until one day I was sitting at a traffic light at an intersection in the streets of Los Angeles on my motorcycle. And I was waiting for the red light to turn green. And sitting behind me was my girlfriend at the time. Now, don't tell Cindy that I'm telling this story because, oh, wait a minute, she's right here in the room. I guess she already knows. But anyway, my girlfriend was a professing believer in Christ at the time. And she leaned forward. I'll never forget this. She leaned forward at that intersection and she said, so when are you going to accept Christ? And I was outraged. It's like, are you kidding me? And immediately my reaction was, to ask that question sounds like you're suggesting you're better than me. Sounds like you're suggesting that you know something I don't know. It sounds like you're suggesting you're a Christian and I'm not. It's like, that's offensive. And my ego flared and my pride was wounded and I got all defensive. And inside I'm thinking, what am I going to say to that? And I'm sitting there revving the engine, right? And I'm an experienced motorcycle rider at that point, and I'm thinking to myself, all I have to do is rev the engine, pop the clutch, I'll do a little bit of a wheelie as I go through the intersection, and I'll leave her on the pavement where she belongs. And then I remembered I had a sissy bar on the back, and all she would ever do is just fall against that. It's like, okay, I guess that's not going to work. And the light turned green, and I went on. And we never discussed it after that. I realized later she was right, that I was partway through this verse. I believed in him, but I'd never accepted him. You see, this is the kind of thing. What we're talking about as a Jesus follower, it doesn't start somewhat, automatically, like as if it's universal. Jesus died, rose again, so now we're all good to go, right? No, there's a decision to be made. And you don't slide into it. You're not born a Christian. You have to make a choice to invite him into your life. And that's what I didn't realize yet when that happened. And a few months later, I gave my heart to Christ. And it happened when somebody explained this to me. Revelation chapter 3, verse 20. So Jesus is speaking here in this particular verse. He says, I stand at the door and knock. And what is he doing? He's knocking at the door of your heart, your life. And he's saying, if you hear my voice, I'm calling to you. If you hear my voice, then open the door. The opening of the door is the decision. It's the accepting of Christ. It's the saying yes to him. And it's inviting him into your heart, into your life, into your future. He says, if you open the door, I will come in and we will be together as friends. We'll have a relationship. There'll be something that isn't true now that becomes true when you make that decision and open up to me. See, he'll never force himself on us. He never pushes his way into our lives, ever. He waits until we say, hey, how about it? I want you to be part of my life. And we give him permission to do what he's very capable of doing and certainly wants to do. And on a particular day in September 1971, in an environment just like this, I gave my heart to Christ and was born again for the very first time. I made a decision. I made a choice to say yes to Jesus. And it's a decision that I want to encourage you to make. Some of you are there where I was. You're at a place where you believe in him, but you haven't yet said yes to him. Well, we met our three individuals here earlier. We met them at a point when they had said yes to Jesus, and their lives continued on afterwards. And I don't know about you, but I'm kind of this mindset or this frame of mind when it comes to faith in Christ. I mean, they described an amazing experience, and that's great. They had an initial compelling experience. But what about afterwards? Like, what happens in the years that followed, and what has their life become since then? And I'm thinking, it's kind of like a bait and switch thing. If an advertiser advertises a product and you buy the product and then it turns out not to perform like you were, as it was advertised, like you were told and led to believe that it would perform, you want your money back. You feel like you've been taken advantage of, been conned. And the same thing with the gospel. If Jesus really does promise us a better life with him, if he promises to make our life better, then I want to know if that's true. I want to see the real evidence of transformed lives. And so let's take a look at what has happened in the years since as we watch this.
So since then, Jesus has really just worked in my life to help me be a better parent to my kids. He's helped me reach 2.5 years sober after struggling with alcohol addiction for years. I had a relationship for 10 years, and it was really rocky and toxic, and because of Jesus, we just got married in October. So the reconciliation that has happened through Jesus has just been amazing. I've made connections in my church, and I've even joined the leadership team. And I just really love to share the love of Christ that has been given to me.
Since that day that I started my walk with Jesus, I can honestly say that he has never left my side. He's been with me, carrying me through very difficult times, and he's lifted me up. He has blessed me through very good times in my life. But one thing I know without question is that he is right here with me, and I can push into him as much as I need to, and he will never, ever abandon me.
So since giving my life to Christ, God has taken the desire to use drugs out of my body, out of my mind. And there's no other explanation for that to happen. I couldn't breathe without it. And the fact that I no longer struggle with that, it's unbelievable. But then it is believable with Christ, so it's just amazing. And then my family, my mother got clean and sober after myself, about a year after I did, and my stepdad and my uncles and cousins, all of which have been strung out for years. And there's just nothing else that explains that the people who have influenced me my whole life, now I can influence them because of how big God is. And it's just beautiful. So because I've been driven my whole life, I was like, I should go back to school. I should do something with myself. I am more than just riding my bicycle around and stealing scrap metal. So I went to the community college and didn't know how to type, so I went and took a keyboarding class. My instructor asked me what I wanted to be when I grow up, and I wanted to be a boss. So she's like, well, Sarah, why don't you start as an admin and work your way up? And I was like, that's a really good idea. So that's exactly what I did. A year into the program, I got a job at Associated Builders and Contractors, and where I've been, I started there as the admin. A year and a half later, I was promoted to Director of Workforce Development, and just January of this year, I've been promoted to Vice President of Member Services. Talk about coming a long way from steel and scrap metal to a vice president of a company. Again, no other explanation besides Jesus Christ.